I'm not a legal brain, but I try and ask the questions that people in this country would want answers to. How in the name of the Lord, OK, do we get to a point where somebody who is the worst child serial killer in our history, allowed, underlined, to cower in her cell and not be made to face the people whose lives she's ruined? I don't get that.
Well, you've got to remember that she's not only not faced the families today, and of course it was all about the families today, really, and those victim personal statements that they read out, as Victoria said, hugely emotional words from them. And she's also refused to confess or admit to these crimes, and at present we don't have any real clue as to her motivation. The prosecution suggested that she did this to try and attract the attention of a doctor that she had a crush on. Texts revealed during the trial, of course, were discovered by police, suggested that she had some sort of relationship. Lucy Letby denied this, but when he gave evidence in court behind a screen, she got up in tears and tried to leave the dock. And the prosecution say she played God. That was something reiterated by the families today, who said that Letby destroyed their lives and played God. And the fact that she didn't appear to face her reckoning, to face them. One of the mothers involved in the trial of two of Letby's victims said her refusal to appear was just one final act of wickedness from a coward. But of course this has sparked calls now for the laws to change, and the government have suggested that new laws are on the way, pressure piling on them. Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, today saying that her refusing to appear was an insult to the families, and adding that the government are looking at options to change the law at the earliest opportunity.
I mean, without sounding cynical, that's OK for the government. I'm amazed that that is not part of our criminal justice system already. And the other thing that always happens when we talk about cases as appalling as this is questions are raised. Apparently, there were concerns given to people inside that hospital about this lady. And we live in a world now, I'm afraid I'm allowed to say this, where we seem to not be too keen on the victim, but we seem to stick up for people. I read an article over the weekend that said they had to make sure that these accusations didn't affect her. This woman is a cold, calculating killer. I suspect a lot of people will be looking in the mirror, won't they, from that hospital and that organisation?
Certainly, and there's an independent inquiry coming down the tracks, of course. The government were very quick to launch that on Friday, and calls growing now to make that public, which would then, of course, mean that the government can compel witnesses, hospital bosses, to give evidence. And there are many calls to hold hospital bosses accountable, not least from the families.
I'll tell you what I've got. I've got Tony Chambers, the ex-CEO of that hospital trust. This is what he had to say. Have a listen.
I've got two pledges to make. The first is, as a chief exec, I pledge to support a culture where the frontline staff are supported in raising concerns. And more importantly, me listening to them when they do.
It's a nice soundbite, but apparently people were made, this is what I read, to apologise to Lucy Letby in the past when accusations about her behaviour were raised. That's appalling, man.
Yes, there were many senior consultants, lead paediatricians at the Countess of Chester, that raised the alarm. They noticed an association with Letby and this inexplicable rise in fatal and near-fatal collapses in these premature newborns on the unit as early as June 2015. And at that point, actually, Dr. Stephen Brewery, who was one of those consultants who raised the alarm, said, "Not nice, Lucy." So you can sort of get a sense that they didn't suspect one of their own.
I think half the problem is what we said at the beginning of the show, actually what the judge said, you know, that you imagine, do you not, that a nurse in a neonatal baby unit, for God's sake, you know, I mean, is going to protect the fact that it was so obviously not. And she I thought what you said as well, no remorse. No, we can't sit here and go, there's a motive. Maybe she couldn't have kids. Maybe. I'm going to bring Benedict and Frankie in as well. Frankie, you've watched this unfold. Thoughts?
It's just horrifying, isn't it? When I was reading up on the case today, I just felt it like in my stomach. It's just the most horrible case. And I think what's clear is that when we talk about this motive, I mean, it just seems completely perplexing. It's one of those things where you just can't quite get your head around it. And I think the hardest thing is that she wouldn't even go and face those families and give them that form of closure, which is that they can essentially look her in the eye as that judgment is delivered. It kind of robs them of that closure.
We did a poll. Should she have been forced to attend court to face the victims of her families? as she was sentenced? Yes, 92% of the public. HB, it's Hartley Brewer again, honestly. She's the criminal and therefore should have been forced to attend court. What the hell is that with the British justice system, Benedict? Allowing murderers to dictate what they're going to do or not to. It's absolutely unbelievable. That's a very salient comment.
It's true, and actually we need to remember that we live in rather a civilised society with rather a civilised, some might even say too civilised, criminal justice system. We don't torture people anymore, we don't hang people anymore, we don't do any of those things that still happen across the world for people who commit crimes far less than this. And so I think that there is an argument for saying, actually, is it really cruel to drag somebody from their cell to face their victims'
No, it's
families?
cruel to murder 6 babies.
But this is the thing. I don't think it is cruel in the broad scheme of things, given that at any other point in British history, actually, you'd probably be swinging for this. But this is the argument that needs to be put to the politicians, because doing this means employing more prison staff, larger prison staff, stronger prison staff, because it's not always a small woman that you're dragging from your cell. It is often, as in the case of Callum Cashman, it is a known violent individual. It also costs a lot of money, people don't know this, to transport prisoners from A to B. It costs £500–600 a time. So it's very easy, I think, for politicians to sit here and say, oh, of course, this must be the case. We all have to sit around here and say, how much has the criminal justice system had cut from it in the last 10 years? As far as I'm aware, it is the single largest recipient of cuts.
There are failings in the criminal justice system. There are failings in the hospitals. Let's just have this debate. You can't. I understand your position. I'm driving this morning with my wife, and as a mother, she's appalled. As a mother, she would say this girl does not deserve to live. Right? Everybody has an opinion. Should we, Frankie, on the basis of a woman who has cold-heartedly killed those babies and attempted to murder, should we bring back corporal punishment? Is that what we're talking about, capital punishment? Is that what we're saying?
I can understand why people would have such a strength in feeling that they would want to bring it back. But I think, and I guess this is kind of a sad position, we have to rise above that, which is essentially that if we're going to charge someone for taking away the life of somebody else, we have to be better than that. I do think that she should have been forced to see the victims in court. I don't care what it costs.
Completely
She waived her right to have any say over how this case court hearing was conducted when she committed those crimes.
I think because I always try and actually give both sides. Somebody then said to me later today when we were having that discussion off air, they went, yeah, but that's too easy. If you're as heinous as Lucy Letby, let her rot in hell for all eternity in her room. Because let me tell you one thing I know about prison. I'm not saying why I know this. She will not be able to go out of the door. Child killers in prison, the worst.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things on this question of bringing back capital punishment. The first thing I should say is this is quite a cold stat. Since we abolished capital punishment, the murder rate in this country has gone up almost 3 times, steadily over time. That is something that should be taken into account when we have this discussion. The cold-hearted rationalist looks at this and says she's going to spend the rest of her life in prison. There is no possibility of reform or anything like that. She is a drain on the resources of the state. But last week, Andy Malkinson was released from prison, having been committed for an incredibly violent rape for 17 years, and elements of the state held back on revealing that he had been wrongly imprisoned. Once upon a time, again, we would have hung him for a lot less. And it's that situation that it makes me feel very awkward about, A, giving the state that power, and B, making accomplices of ordinary men and women in the public on a jury who would have to make that decision and then potentially have to live with the knowledge that they had made a mistake.
I think that's a really good point. Just to bring back to you, Holes, so the government, you said, has ordered an independent inquiry. Keir Starmer, because he's 18 months away from an election, has called for a statutory inquiry. What's the difference? What are we expecting?
That would give the government legal powers to call the hospital bosses to give evidence. And as I said, you mentioned there that it took a long time for them to actually notice and call in the police, despite the concerns that were raised by a number of those...
Well, I'm going to tell you, Tony Chambers, the guy you saw the clip from, the former CEO of the County of Chester Hospital, who reached out to him, no response. Let me just tell you the truth. This is the hospital boss who was accused of shutting down concerns about Lucy Letby, who quit his job from the NHS the minute she was arrested and disappeared off into the twilight with his £1.5 million pension pot. Everybody's shaking their head because that cannot be allowed to happen, can it?
No, it's disgusting. Yeah.
I also have to say the actions of people within that hospital potentially could have ended up prejudicing this trial, altering the outcome. The fact that doctors were made to apologise, they were made to withdraw their complaints, doctors were made to record causes of death as natural causes when they knew it wasn't true, they suspected it wasn't true. The actions of this hospital have added to the suffering of the families of these victims, and it is a disgrace that there are people who are, as you are sort of alluding to, they scarper to prison.